the self that is everything, who we are according to the Upanishads. Somewhere around 800 BCE, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, the dates are contested, and in some sense beside the point, a series of conversations began in the forests and on the riverbanks of northern India that would become the most sustained and most searching inquiry into the nature of the self in human history. The conversations were recorded, eventually, in texts called the Upanishads. They arrive at a conclusion so radical that most of the philosophical traditions that followed them have spent the intervening 3,000 years either trying to accept it or trying to find a way around it. The self is not what you think it is. What you think you are is not what you are, and what you actually are is everything. There is a teaching in the Chandogya Upanishad, one of the oldest and most philosophically rich of the Upanishadic texts, that is given in the form of a conversation between a father named Uddalaka and his son Shvetaketu, who has just returned from 12 years of studying the Vedas and is, in the manner of the recently educated, considerably confident in what he knows. The father asks, "Did your teacher give you the teaching through which the unheard becomes heard, the unthought becomes thought, the unknown becomes known?" The son does not know what he means. The father proceeds through a series of examples. He takes a piece of salt and drops it in water. In the morning, he asks the son to bring him the salt. The son cannot. The salt has dissolved. The father asks him to taste the water from the top of the vessel. It is salty. From the middle, salty. From the bottom, salty. The father then gives him the teaching, Tat Tavam Asi, that thou art. You are that. The self, the Atman, the innermost being, the awareness that knows itself as I is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, the principle from which everything emerges and into which everything returns. The salt has dissolved in the water and cannot be separately located, but it is there, present throughout. So the self has dissolved into the ultimate reality and cannot be separately located from it, and yet it is here, present throughout, the ground of all experience and all existence. This is the central teaching of the Upanishads, and it is an idea of such extraordinary reach that the 3,000 years of philosophical and spiritual practice that it has generated have not exhausted its implications. It is also considered from the perspective of the Western philosophical tradition that the previous essays have been exploring the most radical possible challenge to the assumption that organizes Western thought from Socrates to Sartre, the assumption that the self is a discrete, bounded, individual entity, separate from the world it inhabits and the other selves it encounters. The Upanishads say this assumption is the fundamental error. The self is not separate. The self is the whole. The context. From ritual to inquiry. The Upanishads did not emerge in a vacuum. They emerged from a tradition, the Vedic tradition, the oldest continuous religious and philosophical tradition in the world, in which the relationship between the human being and the ultimate reality had been understood primarily in terms of ritual. The correct performance of the Vedic sacrificial rites was the means by which the human community maintained its relationship with the cosmic powers that sustained existence. The word Upanishad means, approximately, sitting near a teacher, in the intimate pedagogical relationship in which the deepest teachings are transmitted. The Upanishads represent a movement within the Vedic tradition away from the external performance of ritual, toward the internal inquiry into the nature of the self and its relationship to the ultimate reality. The question the Upanishads are asking is, what is the Brahman, the ultimate reality, the principle that underlies the Vedic ritual's cosmic claims? And what is the Atman, the innermost self, the consciousness that underlies the individual person's experience? And the answer they arrive at, through a series of explorations and arguments and contemplative experiments, is they are the same. The Upanishads are not a single text, but a collection of texts. There are over 200 Upanishadic texts in the tradition, of which around 10 to 12 are considered the principal Upanishads and form the basis of most subsequent philosophical and spiritual engagement. They were composed over a long period, the earliest probably in the 8th or 7th century BCE, the latest as late as the 15th century CE, and they represent a diversity of voices, approaches, and emphases rather than a single unified doctrine. What holds them together is the central question, what is Brahman? What is Atman? And what is their relationship? And the central answer, the ultimate reality that underlies the universe and the innermost self, that underlies individual experience, are not two different things. They are one thing, seen from different perspectives. The realization of this identity, not the intellectual. Acceptance of it as a proposition, but the direct experiential recognition of it as the truth of one's own being, is what the Upanishadic tradition calls moksha, liberation, the freedom from the suffering that the mistaken identification of the self with the limited, separate mortal ego produces. Brahman, the ground of everything. Brahman is the most fundamental concept in the Upanishadic tradition, and it is a concept that resists definition in the way that the most fundamental concepts always resist definition, because to define something is to place it in a category, to distinguish it from other things. And Brahman is not in a category and is not other than other things. It is the category in which all categories exist. It is the reality that all other realities depend on. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the oldest and longest, approaches Brahman through a series of increasingly radical negations. The sage Yajnavalkya is asked by the Brahmin Gargi, what is the ground of everything? He answers, what is woven in space? And what is space woven in? He hesitates and then answers, the Atman. But what is the Atman woven in? And here the questioning reaches its limit. The Atman is self-grounding, self-luminous, the awareness that underlies all other awareness, the reality that underlies all other reality, the consciousness that cannot be made the object of any other consciousness because it is the condition of all consciousness. Neti, not this, not this. The method of the negative is Yajnavalkya's preferred approach. Strip away everything that can be said about Brahman, everything that can be described or conceived or imagined, because everything that can be described or conceived or imagined is an object of awareness, and Brahman is the subject that is aware of it, and the subject cannot be made the object without ceasing to be the subject. What remains, when everything that can be negated has been negated, is Brahman not as a thing but as the awareness itself, the pure consciousness that is the ground of all experience. This is a philosophical move of extraordinary sophistication, and it anticipates by more than 2,000 years the moves that Western phenomenology, particularly Husserl's account of the transcendental ego as the condition of all experience, would make in the late 19th and early 20th century. But the Upanishadic account goes beyond the phenomenological. It does not merely identify the self as the condition of experience, but identifies the self with the ultimate reality, the ground of all being. The transcendental ego of Western phenomenology is the condition of my experience. The Atman of the Upanishads is the condition of all experience, all existence, all being, which is why it can be equated with Brahman, the ground of everything. Atman, the self that is not the ego. The Atman, the innermost self, the deepest self, the self that underlies all the various aspects of personality and experience that we ordinarily identify as ourselves, is the central subject of the Upanishadic inquiry. And the inquiry's first move is to distinguish it rigorously from everything that we ordinarily call the self. The Taittiriya Upanishad offers one of the most systematic accounts, through the doctrine of the 5 sheaths or koshas. The ordinary human being identifies herself with the body, the physical sheath, the dense material form. But the body is not the self. It is something the self inhabits, something that changes and deteriorates and eventually dies, while the self that inhabits it remains. Go deeper, and you find the vital sheath, the life force, the prana, the energy that animates the body. Not the self underlies it. Deeper still, the mind sheath, the mental activity, the thoughts and perceptions and memories that constitute ordinary mental life. Not the self is what is aware of the thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. Then the intellect sheath, the discriminating awareness, the capacity for judgment and discernment. Closer to the self, but still not the self. And finally, the bliss sheath, the state of deep sleep or deep meditation in which the usual agitation of mental activity is dissolved into a ground of undifferentiated contentment. Closest to the self, but still not the self. What the self actually is cannot be described in terms of any of the sheaths, because it is the awareness that underlies all of them, the consciousness that is aware of the body, the vitality, the mind, the intellect, even the bliss. It is the witness, the knower, the pure awareness that is never the known, but always the knower. It is, in the Upanishadic formulation, Satchitananda, being, consciousness, lists the three aspects of the ultimate nature of awareness itself. The identification of this innermost self with the ultimate reality Atman is Brahman, is the Mahavakya, the great saying that the Upanishads tradition considers the highest philosophical achievement available to the human mind. It is a saying that cannot be understood through intellectual analysis alone. It can be pointed at, approximated, approached through the progressive negation of what the self is not, through the contemplative practice that strips away the identifications with the sheaths one by one. But the actual recognition, the direct knowing of the identity of the innermost self with the ultimate reality, is not a conclusion drawn from premises. It is an event, the moment of liberation in which the wave recognizes itself as the ocean. Maya, the veil that makes the world. If the Atman is Brahman, if the innermost self is identical with the ultimate reality, then why do we experience ourselves as separate, as individual, as bounded beings in a world of other bounded beings? The Upanishadic tradition's answer is Maya. Maya is one of the most philosophically productive and most consistently misunderstood concepts in the Indian philosophical tradition. It is usually translated as illusion, and the translation has led to the widespread misreading of Upanishadic philosophy as a kind of world-denying nihilism. The world is an illusion, nothing is real, the only escape is the retreat into undifferentiated mystical oneness. This reading is wrong in ways that the tradition itself has always resisted. Maya does not mean that the world does not exist. It means that the world as we ordinarily experience it as a collection of separate, independently real objects and subjects, in which the individual self is fundamentally distinct from everything else, is not the ultimate description of what is. The world has a kind of reality. The salt in the water is real. The individual person is real. The experiences of pleasure and pain and love and loss are real. But they are not real in the way that Brahman is real. They do not have the self-grounding, self-sufficient reality of the ultimate ground, because they depend on Brahman for their existence and their coherence. The metaphor the tradition uses, and it is a metaphor that recurs in multiple Upanishadic texts, is the rope and the snake. Walking at night, you see what appears to be a snake in the path. The fear is real, the seeing is real. The object you are seeing is real, in the sense that there is genuinely something there. But when you bring a light and look more carefully, you see that what you took to be a snake is a rope. The snake was not an illusion in the sense of nothing, it was an error of perception, a mistake about the nature of what was actually there. Maya is the cosmic error of perception, taking the manifold world of individual things and selves for the ultimate reality, when what is actually there, when the light of genuine understanding illuminates it, is Brahman, the one reality appearing in many forms. The consequences of this account for the question of who we are profound and somewhat vertiginous. What we ordinarily take ourselves to be, the individual person with her specific history, her specific personality, her specific desires and fears and attachments, is real in the way that the rope seen as snake is real. There is genuinely something there. But what is actually there, seen clearly, is the Atman, the pure awareness, the ground of all experience, which is identical with Brahman, the ground of all existence. The individual person is the ultimate reality appearing in the form of an individual person. The wave is the ocean taking the form of a wave. The great sayings. The four Mahavakyas. The Upanishadic tradition preserves four great sayings, the Mahavakyas, that are considered the concentrated expressions of the tradition's deepest insight, one from each of the four Vedas. Prajnanam Brahma consciousness is Brahman. From the Aitareya Upanishad of the Rig Veda, the ultimate reality is not a material substance or a divine person or an abstract principle, but pure consciousness, awareness itself. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. From the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad of the Yajurveda, the deepest truth of the individual self is that it is not separate from the ultimate reality. The statement is not the claim of a particular ego, but the recognition that the awareness that says I is the awareness that is the ground of everything. Tattvam asi, that thou art. From the Chandogya Upanishad of the Samaveda, the teaching that Uddalaka gave to Shvetakatu, the salt dissolved in the water, the recognition that the individual self and the ultimate reality are the same. I am Atma Brahma. This self is Brahman. From the Mandukya Upanishad of the Atharva Veda, the innermost self, the awareness that is present in waking and dreaming and deep sleep and the state beyond all three, is identical with Brahman. These four sayings are not four different claims. They are four expressions of the same claim, approaching it from different angles, using different formulations to point at the same recognition. They are not intended to be believed, but to be realized to be made the basis of a contemplative practice that leads, through the progressive clarification of the mind and the progressive dissolution of the false identifications with the sheaths, to the direct recognition of what has always already been the case. The Atman is Brahman, the wave is the ocean, the salt is the water that thou art. The Katha Upanishad, death as teacher. The Katha Upanishad is the most dramatically charged of the principal Upanishads, and the most philosophically accessible for the reader coming from the Western tradition. It takes the form of a conversation between the young Nachiketa and Yama, the god of death, a conversation that Nachiketa has sought out, with a directness and a courage that the tradition celebrates as the model of the genuine philosophical disposition. Nachiketa has been sent, in a moment of ritual carelessness, by his father to the realm of the dead. He arrives at Yama's house and waits for 3 days. When Yama returns and finds a Brahmin guest who has not been received, he offers Nachiketa 3 boons in compensation. For his first 2 boons, Nachiketa asks for his father's peace of mind and for the knowledge of the sacred fire that leads to heaven. Yama grants both. For his third boon, Nachiketa asks, what happens to the person after death? Yama does not want to answer this question. He offers Nachiketa everything else: wealth, pleasure, power, the most beautiful women, the kingship of the entire earth in exchange for a different third boon. Nachiketa refuses. These things are for a day, he says. Keep your horses and your dances and your songs. What I want is the knowledge of what happens after death. Yama, recognizing in Nachiketa the rare student who has the courage and the discernment to receive the highest teaching, proceeds to give it. He distinguishes between the pleasant what appears to be good, what ordinary desire reaches for, and the good what is genuinely beneficial, what genuine wisdom seeks. Most people, he says, choose the pleasant. Only the rare person of genuine discernment chooses the good. He then teaches Nachiketa the Atman, the self that is smaller than the smallest and greater than the greatest, that is not born and does not die, that is not killed when the body is killed. That is the innermost reality of every being, the awareness that underlies all the forms that existence takes. Finer than a hair's tip, in the middle of what moves, the self comes to dwell. Greater than the great, greater than all this world, the self comes to dwell in the heart of a living creature. A person who is not sorrowful sees, by the grace of the Creator, the greatness of the self. Sitting, it travels far. Lying down, it goes everywhere. Who else but me is fit to know that God who is bliss and bliss? The Katha Upanishad's specific contribution to the Upanishadic tradition is its account of the relationship between self-knowledge and the knowledge of death. Nachiketa goes to Yama, to death itself, to learn what the self is. The implication is that the knowledge of death is the condition of the knowledge of the self, because death strips away all the false identifications with the sheaths with the body, the vital force, the mind, and reveals what remains when everything that can be lost has been lost. What remains is the Atman, the awareness that is not born and does not die, the ground of all experience that no experience can touch. This is in its way the Upanishadic version of Heidegger's being toward death, the confrontation with mortality as the condition for the genuine self-knowledge that ordinary life, absorbed in its projects and its distractions, does not require and therefore does not achieve. But the Upanishadic conclusion is more radical than Heidegger's. The self that death reveals is not the finite, thrown, mortal day scene of the existentialist account, but the Atman that is identical with Brahman, the awareness that was never born and will never die, the ocean of which the mortal individual is a wave. Knowing and being. The non-dual recognition. The most philosophically precise formulation of the Upanishadic position is found in the Mandukya Upanishad, the shortest of the principal Upanishads, comprising just 12 verses, and in certain respects the most complete. It examines the states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the fourth state, Turiya, and argues that the awareness which is present in all 4 states, which witnesses the waking experience and the dreaming. experience, and the deep sleep and the fourth state is the Atman, the constant, unchanging, self-luminous awareness that underlies all experience. This awareness is not a state. You cannot enter it and leave it the way you enter and leave waking consciousness or dream consciousness. It is the ground of all states, the awareness that is always already present, the knowing that is prior to every particular known. To recognize it is not to acquire something new, but to stop obscuring what has always been the case. It is, as the tradition says, not an experience but the recognition of what one always already is. The non-dualism Advaita that this teaching expresses is the most thoroughgoing philosophical non-dualism available in any tradition. It is not the dualism of Descartes, who distinguished mind from matter but affirmed both as real. It is not the monism of Spinoza, who identified God with nature and argued that all things are modes of the one substance, though the Spinozan position is closer to the Upanishadic one than any other position in Western philosophy. It is the recognition that the apparent duality between the individual self and the ultimate reality between the wave and the ocean, between the salt and the water, between the knowing subject and the reality it knows is not an ultimate duality, but a manifestation of the one awareness that is both the knower and the known, both the wave and the ocean, both the salt and the water. Adi Shankaracharya, the 8th century philosopher, who systematized the Upanishadic teaching into the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and who is, by general philosophical consensus, one of the greatest philosophers in any tradition, argued that this non-dual recognition was the only fully coherent account of the relationship between the self and reality. Every other account either denies the reality of the self, nihilism, denies the reality of the world, idealism, or denies their identity, dualism, and each of these denials generates philosophical problems that the Advaita position resolves. The salt and the water are not the same thing, and they are not different things. They are the one reality appearing in two different forms, and the recognition of this is not a paradox, but the dissolution of the paradox that arises when we try to separate what was never separate. Who we are, according to the Upanishads. The Upanishadic answer to the question of who we are is the most radical in this series, and it is radical in a specific direction, not outward, toward the community that constitutes the self, as Ubuntu claims, not inward, toward the individual consciousness that must choose itself, as Kierkegaard claims, but through the apparent boundary of the self entirely, toward the recognition that the self and the whole are not two different things. We are the Atman, the pure awareness that is the ground of all experience, that is smaller than the smallest and greater than the greatest, that is not born and does not die, that is present in waking and dreaming and deep sleep. That cannot be made the object of any experience because it is the subject of all experience. We are, therefore, Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, the awareness in which everything appears and from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. The individual person is the ocean appearing as a wave. The wave is real, the wave's particularity, its specific shape, its specific motion, its specific duration is real. But the wave is the ocean, the salt is the water, tattvam asi. The implications for how we live for what we value, what we fear, what we pursue are complete and demanding. If the self is the ultimate reality, then the fear of death is a misidentification. The Atman cannot die. If the self is the ultimate reality, then the suffering produced by the loss of external goods is a misidentification. The Atman cannot be diminished by the loss of what the ego clings to. If the self is the ultimate reality, then the separateness from others that the ego experiences is a misidentification. The Atman that underlies my experience is the same Atman that underlies yours, and the apparent separation between us is the rope seen as a snake. This is the teaching that Uddalaka gave to Shvetaketu, dropping the salt in the water. This is the teaching that Yama gave to Nachiketa, the boy who went to the realm of death to learn what the self is. This is the teaching that has been practiced and explored and debated and realized in the philosophical and contemplative traditions of India for 3,000 years. You are that. The question is whether you know it.